The renovation of the East Archive was supposed to take 11 days. By the 9th, the work crews had found something that made the palace engineers stop billing by the hour and start whispering instead. Princess Saren Vantora was not supposed to be in the sublevels. Her tutors had drilled into her, since she was old enough to walk the receiving halls in formal boots, that a third daughter of House Vantora belonged in council chambers and diplomatic dinners, not crouched in a half-collapsed sub-basement in work boots 3 sizes too large. But the chief restorer, a stooped old Calirian named Warren Dask, had served her family for 40 years and had never once told her no when it mattered. It mattered now. He had sent word through a junior aide rather than the formal channel, which told her everything about how strange the find was before she even saw it. "The foundation here isn't ours," Dask said, holding a lamp against a wall of dark, fused material that did not look like stone, brick, or any alloy used in the last 6 centuries of Vantor architecture. "The palace was built over it. Not into it. Over it." Saren ran a gloved hand along the surface. It was warm. Not sun warm, not machine warm, warm the way skin is warm, a fraction below body heat, as if something underneath was still, faintly, alive. "How old?" she asked. "The geological strata above it predate the founding of the dynasty by at least 4,000 years, Dask said. "Possibly more. I had 3 surveyors confirm it independently because I didn't believe the first reading. 4,000 years. House Vantora's official founding myth, the one carved into the entry arch above the throne room, the one every child of Vantor learned before they learned their own family names, placed the first ruler's arrival on this hill exactly 612 years ago, guided, the story said, by a light that asked for nothing and gave everything." Saren had always assumed that line was poetry. Now she was standing on stone older than poetry, older than the dynasty's right to the hill at all. It took the crew another 6 hours to clear enough debris to reach the case. It sat in a recessed alcove at the center of the buried structure, untouched by 4,000 years of settling earth, as though the room had been built specifically to hold it and nothing else. Cylindrical, roughly the length of Saren's forearm, made of a metal that did not reflect light so much as absorb it and give a little back, reluctantly. There were no seams. No visible hinge, no latch, no maker's mark that matched anything in the compact's known metallurgical registries. Dask had already run a field scan, and the response had come back not unknown but unclassifiable, which according to the registry's own documentation was supposed to be impossible. Across the surface, in a tight, deliberate band, ran a line of symbols. Not Calirian. Not Thran, not Corsa, not any of the 11-member scripts of the compact that Saren had been required to recognize by sight since she was 12. The characters were small, sharp-edged, oddly economical, as if whoever wrote them had been in the habit of saying exactly what needed saying and nothing more. "Has anyone touched it?" Saren asked. "No one but the scanner arm," Dask said. "I wanted you to see it as it was." She crouched in front of it for a long moment. There was a strange, specific feeling that came over her, not fear exactly, and not the giddy curiosity she'd expect from finding buried treasure. It was closer to the feeling of opening a letter addressed to someone who had been dead a very long time, and realizing your own name was somehow also on the envelope. Behind her, the work crew had gone quiet in the particular way crews go quiet when they sense, without being told, that they are no longer being paid for ordinary labor. One of the younger laborers had stopped sweeping debris entirely and stood with his broom forgotten against the wall, staring at the case the way people stare at something that has interrupted their understanding of how old things were allowed to be. Saren didn't blame him. She felt it too, a faint vertigo behind her ribs, as though the floor of her own certainty had shifted half a step to the side. "Run a passive scan," she said. "Nothing active. I don't want it to think we're attacking it." Dask gave her a look. The case was not a that, not a thing that could think, but he ran the scan anyway, because he had learned over 40 years that the princess's instincts were usually worth indulging, even when they sounded strange out loud. The reading came back wrong in a way that made the technician operating the scanner sit back hard in his chair. There was a power source inside the case. Small, stable, and, according to the decay curve the instrument was struggling to model, it had been running, uninterrupted, for somewhere between 4 and 6,000 years. Nothing in Vanter's possession, nothing in the Compact's registries, nothing in any allied or rival nation's known technology, had ever produced a stable power cell with that kind of lifespan. The closest comparison the system could generate, after several seconds of visible processing strain, was a theoretical model from compact physics journals that had never been built because the engineering requirements were considered, by consensus, impossible with known materials. "Is it dangerous?" the technician asked, not looking away from the readout. "I don't know," Saren said honestly. "But I don't think it's a weapon. A weapon doesn't usually get tucked under a 4,000-year-old hill and left to wait." She said it with more confidence than she felt. Because the truth was, sitting there in the lamplit dark beneath her own family's palace, she had no idea what she was looking at. She only knew two things with any certainty. The first was that her family's founding story, the light that asked for nothing and gave everything, was not poetry at all. It was a description someone had simply failed, or refused, to translate plainly. The second was that whatever was inside that case had been built to last far longer than her dynasty, her palace, or possibly her entire civilization's recorded memory of itself, and it had been waiting, patiently, for someone to finally come looking. She thought, standing there, of every formal portrait of her ancestors lining the grand staircase above, robed, composed, painted with the particular confidence of people who believed they understood exactly how their dynasty had come to rule this hill. None of them had known this was beneath their feet. None of them had ever asked why this hill, of all the hills along that ridge, had been chosen. "What happens now?" the young technician asked, still staring at the readout as though it might change if he looked at it long enough. "Now we find out what it's been waiting for," Saren said. She had Dask seal the chamber that night, posted her own household guard at the stairwell instead of the palace garrison, and told no one outside the small circle in that room what they had found. It was, she would later understand, the first decision of many that would determine not just her own future, but whether her world survived what was coming to find it. The court linguist's name was Yevra Holt, and she had spent 30 years building her reputation on the claim that no script in the known galaxy could resist her for longer than a season. She broke that streak in 4 days, and the silence in her workroom afterward had a different quality than her usual frustrated muttering. It was the silence of someone rechecking her own competence. "It isn't that I can't read it," she told Saren, surrounded by projected renderings of the case's inscription pulled apart letter by letter. "It's that it doesn't connect to anything. Every written language we know, even dead ones, shares some root system with something else: trade, contact, conquest, missionary scripts, something. This has no cousins. No loan words. It sits completely alone. Could it be artificial? A cipher rather than a language? I considered that. Ciphers built on top of real languages still carry the statistical fingerprint of the language underneath, letter frequency, rhythm, that sort of thing. This has its own internal logic. Consistent grammar markers, recognizable repetition patterns consistent with a personal name occurring multiple times. Yevra pulled up one cluster of symbols, repeated 3 times across the inscription. "I think this is a name. Possibly a title. I cannot tell you what it says. I can tell you it mattered enough to write twice." She rubbed at her eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in days etched into the lines of her face. "In 30 years, Your Highness, I have decoded dead trade scripts, religious cants nobody had spoken aloud in 3 centuries, even one truly miserable cryptographic dialect the old Corsa military used during the border conflicts. I always found the thread eventually, because language doesn't exist in isolation. People borrow. People steal words from their neighbors, their conquerors, their trading partners. This thing was written by someone who never borrowed a single syllable from anybody. That isn't just rare. As far as I can tell, it's never happened before." Saren had spent the 4 days since the discovery doing what she did best and liked least, moving through the palace's daily performances of duty while her mind stayed 2 floors below in the dark. Trade negotiations with a Thren delegation. A dispute between two minor houses over water rights. A formal dinner where she smiled at the correct intervals and contributed nothing to a conversation about tariff structures she could have recited in her sleep. It was during that dinner, oddly, that the first real clue arrived, not from a lab, but from her own grandmother. The Dowager Mareth Vantora was 91 years old, sharp as a blade kept properly oiled, and the only living person in the palace who still remembered the version of the founding story told before the official one was carved into the entry arch. Saren found her afterward in the smaller sitting room she preferred, and asked, as carefully as she could manage, whether her grandmother knew any old names for the people in the founding tale. Mareth's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "You found something," she said. It wasn't a question. "I can't say more yet." "You don't have to." The old woman folded her hands. "When I was a girl, before the historians decided the story needed tidying for the throne room wall, my own grandmother used a different name for the light in the tale. Not light. A people. She called them the Far Walkers." She paused, watching Saren's face carefully. "She also told me never to repeat that name outside the family, because it frightened her own mother to hear it spoken aloud. I never understood why. I assumed it was superstition. Old women holding on to old fears the way old women do." "Did she say why they were frightening?" "Only once. She said the Far Walkers had fought a war so terrible that the rest of the sky agreed, by unspoken consent, to stop asking them questions about it. She said when the Far Walkers finally went quiet, every other people in the sky breathed easier, and then, eventually, forgot to wonder why they'd gone quiet at all." Mareth's hands tightened slightly over each other. "She said, when the Far Walkers sleep, the sky is safe. Should they wake, ask why before you ask for help." The phrase settled into Saren's chest like a stone dropping into still water. "Why are you asking me this now, after all these years?" Mareth said, studying her granddaughter's face with the unhurried patience of someone who had outlived several generations of court intrigue and recognized the shape of real worry when she saw it. "You've never once cared about the old nursery version of the founding story. You used to roll your eyes at it when you were small." "I think I might have found one of them," Saren said quietly. "Or something they left behind." Her grandmother went very still. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual dry humor entirely. "Then I hope you've already decided to be careful, child, because my grandmother did not pass that warning down to scare children at bedtime. She passed it down because somebody, a very long time before her, decided it was worth remembering, even after everyone had forgotten why. She did not tell her grandmother about the power source that had been running, uninterrupted, since before either the official or unofficial founding stories began. She wasn't ready to say it out loud. But she carried the warning back down to the sealed chamber that night, and stood in front of the case for a long time before she let Dask resume the analysis. The breakthrough came 2 days later, and it came not from the inscription, but from the case itself. One of Yevra's junior researchers, testing whether the surface responded to specific frequencies the way some old compact-era security systems did, ran a slow sweep of harmless acoustic pulses across the metal. At a frequency just below the range of normal Calirian hearing, the case answered. A thin seam of light appeared along what had looked, until that moment, like solid unbroken metal. No mechanism whirred. No panel slid. The case simply, briefly, became something other than closed, and from within it, a narrow beam projected upward, painting a fragment of a star map across the chamber's low ceiling. Dozens of unfamiliar star clusters, 3 of them circled in a soft, deliberate red, and at the center of the projection, unmistakably, a marker resting almost exactly where Vantor itself sat in the galaxy. The projection lasted 4 seconds before the scene closed and the case went dark again, patient as before. Nobody in the room spoke for a long moment. "That wasn't a malfunction," Dask finally said. "That was a greeting." Saren stared at the spot on the ceiling where the map had been, the red circled stars already burning themselves into her memory. "No," she said slowly. I think it was a question. I think it's been waiting 4,000 years to ask whether anyone down here was finally paying attention. She had Dask double the seal on the chamber that night, and quietly, without informing the full council, requested an audience with the Compact's regional archive office, the kind of request that, once filed, could not be easily taken back, and that would, within the week, draw eyes to Vanter that the dynasty had spent 6 centuries trying to avoid. The request to the Compact's regional archive was supposed to be routine, a quiet inquiry into pre-compact alloy registries, filed under a generic research designation. Saren had hoped it would draw a clerk's mild curiosity and nothing more. Instead, within 3 days, it drew Ambassador Calix Thren. He arrived at a Shendel palace with the easy, unhurried confidence of a diplomat who had never once in his career needed to ask for anything twice, and he made no secret of why he'd come. The Thren Concord, the Compact's largest and most heavily armed member state, had flagged Saren's inquiry the moment the words unclassifiable alloy and pre-compact power source appeared together in the same filing. You understand, Calix said, seated across from Saren in a formal receiving room with the kind of patient smile she'd learned not to trust, that anything of unknown origin, found within compact territory, technically falls under joint archaeological review. We're not here to take anything from House Ventura. We're here to help you catalog it properly. You're here because you think it might be a weapon, Saren said. The smile didn't waver. I'm here because 4,000 years is a very long time for a power source to keep running, Your Highness. In my experience, things built to last that long were either built to heal something, or built to fight something. I'd like to know which, before anyone else does. He leaned back, unhurried, and let the silence stretch just long enough to remind her that he had a fleet behind his patients and she had a household guard. You're young, he added, not unkindly. Younger than most rulers who find themselves holding something this significant. I've seen what happens to small houses that try to manage a discovery like this alone, without resources, without allies. It rarely ends with the small house keeping what it found. Is that a threat, Ambassador? It's an observation. I'd much rather it never become relevant. It was, she had to admit, a fair point, and not one she could afford to dismiss out of pride. But she also understood, with the particular clarity that came from a lifetime of court politics, exactly what Joint Archaeological Review would mean in practice. A Thren survey team installed in her own palace, Thren engineers with first access to whatever lay beneath it, and a quiet, gradual erosion of Vanter's claim to a discovery made on Vanter soil, under Vanter's own dynasty. She gave him careful, limited cooperation, shared images of the inscription, the surface composition data, nothing of the star map, nothing of the warning her grandmother had given her. And the moment he left for the evening, she went back down into the sublevels and told Dask to find the sealed door faster. That night, alone in the antechamber after the others had gone to rest, Saren found herself talking to the case the way a person talks to a portrait of someone long dead, quietly, without expecting an answer, mostly to organize her own thoughts. I don't know what you are, she said. I don't know if you can even hear me. But if there's anyone left who built you, I would very much like to know what I'm protecting before someone with a fleet decides for me. The case said nothing, of course. It only sat there, warm and patient, the way it had sat through 6 centuries of her family's rule and 4,000 years before that. Because there was a door. They'd known since the second week that the chamber holding the case was not the structure's full extent, only an antechamber, built at the top of a stairwell that descended into solid rock and ended at a wall that was not stone at all, but the same dark, light-absorbing alloy as the case itself, fused seamlessly into the surrounding rock with no visible seam, no handle, no mechanism. The breakthrough, when it came from the star map. Yevra Holt, working long nights cross-referencing the 4-second projection against Vanter's own modern stellar charts, realized the 3 red-circled stars weren't random landmarks. They were a sequence, and when she mapped the angles between them against the position of the case within the antechamber, she found they formed a precise resonance pattern, the kind used by old security systems that required not a key, but a specific rhythm of frequencies, played in order, to unlock. It took 2 more days to translate the star positions into acoustic pulses. On the evening of the 4th, with Calix-Thren safely occupied at a formal dinner 3 floors above and unaware anything had changed, Saren stood in front of the buried door with Dask and Yevra on either side of her, and gave the order to play the sequence. The first 2 pulses produced nothing. On the third, a deep vibration ran through the floor, faint but unmistakable, like something enormous turning over in its sleep after a very long rest. Dust sifted down from the antechamber ceiling in a fine, pale rain, and somewhere beneath their boots, ancient gears that had not moved in 4 millennia began, reluctantly, to remember their purpose. The wall did not open so much as remember how to. A seam appeared, then widened, ancient hinges grinding free of millennia of stillness with a groan that seemed to come from the rock itself rather than the metal. Cold air rolled out, air that had not moved in 4,000 years, carrying a faint, sterile scent none of them had words for. Beyond the opening, a stairwell descended into darkness lit only by the dim, automatic flicker of lights waking up one by one along the walls, as if the entire structure had simply been asleep, and was now, slowly, opening its eyes. Dask raised his lamp toward the opening and let out a breath that wasn't quite a word. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "I don't think your family found this hill by accident 600 years ago. I think you were led here." Yevra, standing at the edge of the stairwell with her instruments already humming back to life, said nothing for a long moment, then voiced the thought all 3 of them were circling without quite landing on. If that's true, then the founding story isn't just decoration that happened to land on top of something real. It's the cover. Someone, a very long time ago, helped your ancestors choose this hill on purpose, then let the truth get smoothed down into a bedtime story so nobody would come looking too soon. The question is whether that someone is still around to explain why. Saren stood at the threshold for a long moment, the warning her grandmother had given her circling in her mind: should they wake, ask why before you ask for help, and weighed it against 6 centuries of her dynasty's founding myth, against Calix-Thren's smiling patience 3 floors above, against the quiet certainty settling into her chest that whatever waited at the bottom of those stairs was about to make every political calculation she'd ever learned look small. "Then I intend to ask," she said, and stepped down into the dark. The stairwell ended in a room larger than the throne hall above it, and far older than anything Vanter had ever built. The lights, once fully roused, revealed a space that was unmistakably a working installation rather than a tomb: consoles built into curved walls, dormant screens, a low hum of machinery cycling up from a centuries-long idle state, and at the center of it all, a single chair facing a wall of dark glass, as if someone had simply stepped away from their post and never come back. There was a cup on the small table beside the chair, sealed under a thin film of preservation coating that had kept it from crumbling to dust across 4,000 years. There was a folded garment draped over the chair's arm, the fabric stiffened with age but still recognizably a garment, something a person had worn and chosen to leave behind rather than carry with them. Small, ordinary, human details that struck Saren harder than any of the larger technology around them, because they made the keeper feel less like a legend and more like someone who had simply lived here, alone, for longer than any single Vantora reign in recorded history. "This wasn't a vault," Yevra said, turning slowly to take in the room. "This was someone's home." Dask moved through the space with the particular reverence of a man who had spent his career restoring old things and had never, in 40 years, restored anything this old. He paused at the chair for a long moment without touching it. 40 years I've worked in this palace," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "I always assumed I understood what old meant. I don't think I did, until right now." It took the team 3 days to bring enough of the installation systems online to access anything readable, and another 2 before Yevra, working from a damaged but partially intact data core recovered from a console near the chair, managed to extract fragments of a written log. The language was the same as the case's inscription, but longer passages gave her pattern recognition software enough to work with. The translations that emerged were partial, halting, full of gaps where corruption had eaten the data away. But what survived was enough. Day 1400 and something, the numbers gone, of this posting. Vanter's first settlers reached the hill today. I watched them from the ridge. They have no idea what's under their feet, and that's exactly how it needs to stay, for now. Maybe forever, if we're lucky. I left them the marker stone at the spring. If the old stories hold, somebody's descendant will dig deep enough to find me eventually. I hope it's a long way off. I hope, selfishly, it's after my watch is done. Entry, much later, number lost, they're building something permanent on the hill now. A real settlement. Good. Means they're staying, means the ridge stays quiet, means I can keep doing the only job that matters, watching the seal hold. Command says these postings are meant to be invisible. I understand why. I don't love it. For years since I last spoke to another living person who wasn't a recording. Entry, undated, badly corrupted, watched the new ruler's coronation from the ridge today, the one they're calling the founder now, the one the children's stories will probably remember 100 years from now. Strange, watching someone become a legend in real time while standing close enough to see that they're just a person, tired and underslept like everyone else. I almost went down to introduce myself. Almost. Command protocol says no, and command protocol has been right every time I've wanted to ignore it, so I didn't. I left the marker stone where they'd find it eventually instead. Easier that way. For both of us. Final clear entry, power reserve stable for the foreseeable future, centuries, the engineers tell me, maybe longer if nothing disturbs the core. I'm logging full status and sealing the chamber behind the standard protocol. Whoever you are, reading this, if you're reading this, it means either the seal failed, or someone finally got curious enough to look. I hope it's the second one. If it's the first, you need to know what's actually down here, and you need to know it fast. Authorization required for full disclosure. I'm leaving that authorization keyed to resonance pattern alone, because keys can be stolen and stars can't. Good luck. Whoever you are. I mean that. Saren read the translation 3 times before she trusted herself to speak. There's a name, Yevra said quietly, pointing to a recurring symbol cluster at the head of each entry, the same repeated marker she'd flagged in the very first scan of the case, weeks ago. I still can't render it phonetically. But it's the same person, every time. They were here a long time, Your Highness. Alone, by the sound of it. Watching something they call the seal. Dask, who had been quietly running diagnostics on the deeper systems while the translation work continued, looked up with an expression Saren hadn't seen on him before. Not excitement. Something closer to alarm, carefully contained. There's a sublevel beneath this one, he said. Sealed separately, more heavily than anything else in the structure. The power drawdown there isn't idle. It's active, and it's been gradually increasing for the past 6 days. Since we opened the door, Saren said. Since approximately the time we opened the door, yes. The room went very quiet. Whatever the keeper had spent a lifetime alone watching, it was awake enough now to notice that someone had finally come looking, and the increasing power draw suggested it did not entirely approve. It was that night, while Saren sat alone in the antechamber turning the keeper's final entry over in her mind, you need to know what's actually down here, and you need to know it fast, that Dask brought her the report from the surface that changed the shape of everything. Ambassador Calix Thren had requested, through official compact channels, immediate joint custody of the site, citing the now undeniable activity readings his own people had detected from orbit. A Thren survey vessel was already inbound, 3 days out, with a full archaeological and military escort. Saren understood, reading the request, that she no longer had the luxury of choosing between caution and curiosity. Whatever was sealed in that lower chamber, whatever the keeper had spent a lifetime alone protecting, was going to be found, by her, carefully, or by someone else, carelessly, and very soon. She gave Dask the order to begin preparing access to the final seal that same night. The deepest chamber was smaller than the keeper's living quarters above it, and built entirely differently, not for comfort, but for containment. Thick walls of the same dark alloy ringed a recessed pit at the center of the room, covered by a heavy convex plate etched with the same warning symbol repeated at even intervals around its rim, a single character Yevra had already learned to recognize from 3 other places in the keeper's logs, always attached to instructions never to proceed further without authorization. The air in the chamber felt different from the rest of the installation, colder in a way the environmental readings couldn't entirely account for, with a faint pressure behind Saren's ears that reminded her, unpleasantly, of standing too close to a transformer station. None of her engineers could explain it. Dask's working theory, offered quietly and without much confidence, was that it was nothing physical at all, only the particular unease of standing near something that 4,000 years of careful, deliberate engineering had been built specifically to keep separate from the rest of the world. The power readings Dask had flagged were coming from beneath that plate. "I want full readings before anyone goes near it," Saren said, and meant it as much for herself as for the team. 3 days. That was what Calix Thren's inbound vessel had given her. She intended to understand what she was protecting before anyone with an armed escort arrived to claim it. What the readings showed, once Yevra finished correlating them against the Keeper's recovered logs, was not a weapon in any sense Saren had been braced for. It was worse, in its own quiet way, because it wasn't a tool waiting to be used. It was a problem that had never fully gone away. The Keeper's logs called it, in the clearest translated passage Yevra could recover, the hollow tide, and the entries describing it were sparse, fragmented, and written with the particular flatness of someone who had been trained not to dramatize what they were guarding, because dramatizing it would have made the loneliness of guarding it alone unbearable. From what survived, a picture assembled itself slowly. Long before Vanter's first settlers reached the hill, long, it seemed, before most of the Compact's current member species had even achieved spaceflight, a self-replicating threat had moved through a region of the galaxy, converting matter, biological and structural alike, into copies of itself with a speed and hunger that no single species military had been able to match. The logs didn't dwell on numbers. They didn't need to. One line, translated with low confidence but unmistakable in tone, read simply, "We stopped counting worlds after the first dozen, because counting didn't help anyone stop it." What had stopped it, eventually, was not a weapon either. It was containment, a coordinated, costly effort led by a species the logs referred to, in their own oldest written records, simply as the Far Walkers. The same name Saren's grandmother had carried down through whispered family history, frightened out of an old woman by her own grandmother, generations removed from whatever war had actually happened. The hollow tide had not been destroyed. According to the Keeper's own log, it could not be destroyed, not with anything available at the time. It had been broken into isolated, dormant fragments and sealed, hundreds of small containment sites scattered across worlds the Far Walkers judged stable enough, and trustworthy enough, to host a seal quietly for as long as necessary. Vanter's Hill was one of them. The Keeper, and an unknown number of others like them across the galaxy, had spent their lives, and in many cases, it seemed, the rest of their lives after that, making sure each fragment stayed asleep. And then, deliberately, the Far Walkers had stopped being visible at all. One of the clearer fragments put it plainly, easier to keep 300 seals quiet if the rest of the sky isn't watching closely enough to ask why a handful of unremarkable worlds mattered so much. Let them think the Far Walkers had wandered off. Let them think they'd vanished. Safer for the seals. Safer for everyone, if they were honest, given what people tended to do when they were frightened of something they didn't understand. Saren sat with that for a long time after Yevra finished reading it aloud. It explained everything her grandmother had half remembered and not understood, the warning passed down as superstition, the quiet relief older generations of Vanter felt when the Far Walkers went to sleep, the centuries of a galaxy slowly, collectively forgetting to ask what, exactly, it had once been so afraid of. It also explained, with a cold and immediate urgency, why the power readings beneath the convex plate had begun climbing the moment her excavation crew reopened a 4,000-year-old door. "The seal isn't failing because of age," Dask said quietly, reading the latest diagnostic. "It's failing because something is actively probing it. Externally." "Thren?" Saren asked, though she already suspected the answer wasn't that simple. "Possibly their survey scans, inadvertently. Possibly something else entirely." Dask's expression was grim. Either way, Your Highness, we no longer have 3 days. The system's automated response has already triggered something. There's an outgoing transmission, originating from this chamber, that started the moment the readings crossed a threshold 6 hours ago. I don't know where it's going. I only know the Keeper's own system sent it, and the Keeper's own systems haven't done anything without good reason in 4,000 years. Saren looked at the warning symbol ringing the plate, then at the dark stairwell leading back up toward her palace, her court, and an ambassador's warship still 2 days out and closing. She thought of the Keeper's chair upstairs, the folded garment left behind, the quiet, exhausted devotion of a single person standing watch over this exact spot for a lifetime so that nobody else would ever have to learn what she was now learning in a matter of hours. It seemed a cruel kind of inheritance, to receive the burden without any of the preparation the Keeper must once have had. Somewhere out in the dark beyond Vanter's sky, an old, automated distress call had just gone out for the first time in 4,000 years, and whatever, or whoever, was meant to answer it, she had no way of knowing whether they were still listening. The ship that answered was not what Saren expected. She had spent 2 days bracing for something enormous, the kind of vessel that matched 4,000 years of buried legend and a war terrible enough to silence an entire galaxy's curiosity. What dropped out of transit above Vantir, 26 hours after the Keeper's automated transmission went out, was small. A single corvette, unarmored in any way that read as deliberately threatening, broadcasting an identification code that Vantir's orbital traffic control had never seen before and could not match to any registry, compact or otherwise. It requested landing clearance with a politeness that felt almost out of place given the circumstances, and it requested it specifically, by name, for Princess Saren Ventura. Saren stood on the same landing terrace where she had once watched visiting dignitaries arrive with their honor guards and ceremonial fanfare, and felt, for the first time in weeks, something almost like relief, though she made herself hold it carefully, the way Dask had taught her years ago to hold any feeling that arrived faster than the facts that should justify it. Calix Thren's survey vessel arrived 11 hours later, considerably larger and considerably less polite about its intentions. Saren met both parties in the same receiving hall, because she had decided, somewhere in the long sleepless stretch between the transmission and the corvette's arrival, that she was done letting other people set the terms of what happened on her own world. The human who stepped off the corvette introduced herself simply as Commander Elena Reyes, and she carried herself with the particular tired steadiness of someone who had done a difficult job alone for a very long time and had stopped expecting anyone to make it easier. She was, she explained without much ceremony, the latest in a long line, keepers, watchers, the inheritors of a duty that had passed down through a small number of families for longer than most galactic civilizations had kept continuous written records. Her own line had maintained 3 other seals, on 3 other worlds, none of which had ever been found. Your hill is the first one anyone's reactivated in 2 centuries, Reyes said, standing in the antechamber, looking at the Keeper's empty chair with an expression Saren recognized immediately, because she'd worn something close to it herself. We don't get a lot of warning when it happens. We get less time than we'd like to respond properly. I'm sorry it took as long as it did. Calix Thren, for his part, was considerably less interested in apologies. His engineers had already begun arguing, loudly and through translated channels, that a fragment of the hollow tide represented a strategic asset too significant to leave under the unilateral control of either a minor dynasty or an unregistered independent operator with no compact accreditation whatsoever. There were words like extraction and secure relocation used in ways that made Reyes's expression go very still. You don't move a fragment, she said flatly, when the proposal reached her directly. You don't touch the seal mechanism with anything that wasn't built specifically to read it. Every world that's tried to study one of these instead of just keeping it asleep has lost the world they were standing on when they tried. And yet your people built the seals, Calix said, unconvinced. Presumably you understand them. My people built 300 seals across worlds we never told anyone about, specifically so nobody powerful enough to be tempted would ever get the chance to try this conversation, Reyes said. I'm not here to hand you a weapon, Ambassador. I'm here because the readings tell me your survey scans destabilized this seal by roughly 4% in 18 hours, and at the current rate, this hill has somewhere between 60 and 90 hours before containment fails completely. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. What followed was not the kind of battle Saren had half-braced for, somewhere in the back of her mind, ever since reading the Keeper's grim, spare accounts of an ancient war. There was no dramatic confrontation, no weapons drawn. There was instead a desperate, technical, exhausting 40 hours of work, Reyes's small crew interfacing directly with systems only their bloodline had ever been trained to read, Vanter's own engineers running support and power redistribution under Dask's increasingly hoarse direction, and Saren herself, against every instinct of court protocol, standing watch at the threshold of the deepest chamber because Reyes had asked her to, specifically, by name. Why me? Saren had asked, in one of the rare quiet moments. Because the original treaty, 4,000 years ago, wasn't made with a country, Reyes said, not looking up from the console she was recalibrating by hand. It was made with a person. Your line. Somebody decided, a very long time ago, that your family could be trusted to keep a secret for as long as it took, even without understanding why. I think that trust should mean something, at the end of it. I think it should be a Vantora standing here when we close this back up, not a Thren military engineer. Does it ever stop feeling like too much? Saren asked. The watching. The waiting for something that might never come. Reyes was quiet for a moment, her hands never pausing over the console. No, she admitted. But you stop expecting it to. That's most of what the job is, honestly, not heroism, just showing up for the version of your life you didn't choose, over and over, until eventually it starts to feel less like a burden and more like just who you are. She glanced up briefly. You'll understand that better than most people your age ever will, after this week. In the final hour, with the seal's readings climbing toward a threshold Reyes's own instruments flagged in stark warning color, it was not Reyes alone who completed the recalibration. It was Reyes, talking Dask through a final manual override neither of them had ever performed before, while Saren held a resonance key steady against a failing lock with her own hands, because the system required a living presence at that exact point, and there was no one else close enough, or trusted enough, to do it. The convex plate sealed fully at the 11th hour of the 90th, with a deep, settling groan that Saren felt in her teeth more than heard. The climbing readings fell, slowly, back to the same patient, dormant hum they had carried for 4,000 years before anyone disturbed them. Calix Thren, watching the final numbers stabilize from across the room, said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, for perhaps the first time since his arrival, he looked genuinely unsettled rather than calculating. I came here, he admitted, expecting to find a weapon worth claiming. Everyone does, Reyes said, finally sitting down, exhaustion settling visibly into her shoulders now that the work was done. That's usually the problem. The formal report to the Compact Assembly took 3 weeks to draft and considerably longer to argue over. Saren sat through every session personally, which surprised several delegates who had expected a minor dynasty's princess to leave the negotiating to senior diplomats. She had decided, somewhere during the 90 hours beneath her own palace, that she was no longer willing to let other people narrate a story she had been the one to live. The arguments, when they came, were predictable in shape if not in detail. Several of the larger member states pressed hard for full compact oversight of every known SEAL site, citing the obvious security implications of leaving such facilities under the control of individual worlds. A smaller bloc, led quietly by delegates who had clearly spent the intervening weeks talking to historians of their own, argued the opposite, that secrecy, not centralized control, was the only thing that had kept the Hollow Tide's remnant stable for 4,000 years, and that turning containment sites into prizes to be fought over by ambitious governments was the single fastest way to repeat whatever catastrophe had made secrecy necessary in the first place. Reyes testified once, briefly, and left the chamber in absolute silence afterward. She had brought, without comment, a recovered fragment of casualty data from one of the war's worst engagements, numbers so large that several delegates visibly stopped arguing the moment they saw them. The final agreement, hammered out over difficult weeks, did not give the Thren Concord, or any other compact power, custody of the seal beneath Vantir. It established instead a quiet, narrow precedent, recognition that the old lighthouse network, as Reyes's people called it, retained sole technical authority over any seal site, with host worlds granted formal partnership status rather than mere custodianship. Vantir became the first world in recorded compact history to hold that status openly, rather than secretly, by choice rather than by accident of discovery. It was not, Reyes told her privately before the corvette finally departed, a small thing. Most worlds that find one of these never get the chance to choose how the story ends, she said. Most of them panic, or get greedy, or get exploited by someone who shows up faster than help does. You didn't. That matters more than you probably realize yet. The Keeper's chamber was not sealed away again, but neither was it open to the public. Saren had it quietly restored instead, the chair repaired, the consoles preserved, a small plaque added at Yevra's insistence, bearing as close a translation of the Keeper's name as the broken data core would ever yield. It seemed right, somehow, that after 4,000 years alone, the Keeper should at least be remembered by something more than a number on a corrupted log. She brought her grandmother down to see it, once the restoration was finished. Mareth stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking, taking in the chair, the preserved cup, the quiet hum of machinery that had outlasted every Ventura who had ever ruled above it. My grandmother would not have believed this room could be made to feel peaceful, she finally said. She only ever told the story as a warning. I think she would have liked knowing it could also be an honor. Will you tell it differently now? To the rest of the family? I'll tell it exactly as it happened, Mareth said. Which, I've come to understand, is the only version of any story worth keeping. The case that started it all, the cylindrical artifact found warm and waiting in the antechamber, was given a permanent place in the restored East Archive, not locked away, but displayed openly, with an honest account of what it was and what it had guarded, rather than the polished, comfortable version of the founding story that had hung on the throne room arch for 6 centuries. Saren ordered the old inscription above the arch updated as well. A light that asked for nothing and gave everything became, instead, something closer to the truth her grandmother had half remembered, a watcher who asked to be trusted, and a family who chose, across 4,000 years, to be worthy of it. Commander Reyes did not stay long. The Lighthouse Network, she explained, still maintained dozens of other seals across dozens of other worlds, most of which had no idea what slept beneath them, and most of which would, statistically, eventually need the same kind of attention Vantirs had just received. There were not enough keepers left to watch everything as closely as the old logs implied there once had been. What happens to the ones who never get found? Saren asked her, the night before the corvette left. Some of them stay quiet forever, Reyes said. That's the best outcome, honestly, even if it means nobody ever learns what was almost there. Not every story needs an audience to count. Sometimes the job is just making sure there's no story to tell at all. And the ones that do get found? They get whatever the people who find them decide to make of them. Reyes looked at her directly then, something almost gentle in it. You made something good out of this one. I don't say that lightly. I've seen it go the other way more times than I'd like to remember. We'll come back, she said, the morning her corvette prepared to leave Vantir's orbit. Not because anything's wrong. Because now there's a relationship worth maintaining, instead of just a secret worth keeping. That's new, for us. I think it's worth doing properly. Saren watched the small, unremarkable ship vanish into transit from the same palace balcony where, as a child, she had once been told the founding story exactly as the throne room arch presented it, simple, certain, comfortably distant from anything that demanded real understanding. She thought about the Keeper's final clear log entry, the one Yevra had translated in that quiet, candlelit room weeks ago that already felt like a different lifetime. If you're reading this, it means either the seal failed, or someone finally got curious enough to look. I hope it's the second one. It had been the second one. It had taken a cracked foundation, a stubborn restorer who never told her no, a linguist who refused to call a mystery unsolvable, and a willingness, hers, finally, after a lifetime of being taught that royal duty meant accepting the story she was given, to ask why, instead of simply accepting that the sky had once, long ago, gone quiet. The galaxy had spent 4,000 years treating humanity's silence as an ending. Standing on that balcony, watching a small gray ship disappear into the stars her own ancestors had once been quietly, deliberately trusted to watch over, Princess Saren Ventura understood, with a clarity that settled into her chest like something coming finally to rest, that it had never been an ending at all. It had only ever been a very long, very patient beginning, waiting 4,000 years for someone to finally dig deep enough to ask.